Hello and welcome to episode 83 of The Dive Down, a Magic the Gathering podcast for the casual spike, focused on the latest decks, trends, and strategies in Modern and Pioneer, for now. My name is Stanislav here in Chicago, and with me on the line from Denver, Colorado, it's the one and only Shane Beeps.
Stanislav, did you play Magic this week?
I did, yeah.
So did I. It was a good week. There was some magic, there was some camping, there was some 95-degree heat. Yeah, I got to talk about the weather. I'm 40 now, every week.
Did you play more MTGO or Arena?
You know what? I did get back into Arena. I was doing some historic mono red because I had to follow after my mythic role model, Stanislav Golovchuk. That was, but I've also been playing a lot more Magic Online. I did a little bit of both. It's been a good week.
Nice. Also with us back from the Sunshine State, it's the Godfather, Dave Harbarger.
I was pretty much in the opposite of the Sunshine State. You know that.
It was like the overcast state or what?
I mean, it rained a couple days, but I was in Lake Country, friends.
Lake Boy.
Beautiful, northern Wisconsin. It was fun to be away from people and responsibly away from people in public places. No.
Did you water ski?
No, I didn't do anything like that. We just hung out on the beach.
Playing a euchre?
No, we played a lot of rummy, like gin rummy with 3 people.
Did you guys know that the last time I went to northern Wisconsin, I actually went tubing for the very first time in my life? And I kind of figured it was a Door County staple.
Well, I don't have a friend with a boat, and I don't have a boat.
You've got a child. You got two kids. Have them pull you.
They don't have boats.
They're too young to tube as well.
Yeah.
On this week's episode, we're going to take a look at how and if the ban and unban from last week's BNR affected the Modern and Pioneer metagames. We've got a few big events to talk about, some light metagame analysis, finally topped off with a healthy portion of what we've been up to in the last week or so in MTGA and MTGO. But first, it's housekeeping. Big thanks this week go to Bob P. and Dylan P. for increasing their tiers of Patreon support. Thank you so much for your ongoing support of the show and podcast. Really means the world to us, really.
Yeah, if you're interested in helping support the show, getting yourself access to the super secret Slack server, various bits of swag that we've made. I recently shipped out a bunch of the new pins that we made up and Dave designed. People seem pretty amped on those. If you want to get your hands on those, some custom tokens, playmats.
Surprisingly, our pins did not lead to any bans for once.
Yeah, we really took a chance. We have inverter pins, we have Heliod pins. Oh, the 1+1+7 pin did get banned in Pauper.
Mm-hmm.
So our Pauper listeners, you're not going to be able to use that pin any longer. But yeah, if you want to check that out, go to our Patreon. It's patreon.com/thedivedown. We appreciate any support you want to throw our way.
And if you'd like to help us while you're playing Magic, go ahead and check out manatraders.com. Manatraders.com is the rental service that we use on MTGO to rent the Pioneer and Modern decks that we play. And so if you'd like to check them out, sign up, use code THEDIVEDOWN to get 15% off of your first 3 months.
Yeah, and as you may or may not know, Mana Traders also has their own tournament series going on right now. And the cool thing about their tournament series is that you don't even have to be a Mana Traders subscriber to participate. But for those of you who are Mana Trader subscribers, and those of you who happen to do well in this tournament series, you get more prize support. So it kind of pays to subscribe if you're also a winner. But it's free to play if you're not.
Like Stan, a winner.
I don't know about that yet.
Stan's just been winning big this week. It's a little bit of a tease, but
we're all winning big this week, baby.
Yeah, the casino by my house now supports Magic the Gathering. So I've just been spiking the retirees.
The fish.
That well-known retiree neighborhood in Chicago that you live in.
All right, with all that out of the way, let's jump right into the breakdown this week. And rather than talking about a single weekend of tournaments, we decided to take a big picture look at the last week of MTGO tournaments, including the weekend's challenges, as well as the weekday preliminary events. And we put together some charts, some graphs, some pivot tables to get a sense of what has been winning immediately post-ban And we even had a chance to go a little deeper look at the individual decks to start to piece together maybe what new tech they're using or how they're maybe metagaming toward whatever changes are happening in our favorite formats.
So first up, why don't we take a look at Modern, the format where it all started. And as if anybody needed a reminder, last week, Arkham's Astrolabe was banned in Modern. And so what we're going to be doing is taking a look at the metagame that's evolved since then.
Hey, can I jump in really quick? Dave, we missed you last week, even though we loved having Everett on as usual. I don't know if I really heard your reaction to the BNR.
I would say it was very consistent with your reactions as a team. I was pretty on board with Astrolabe being banned. Not like a broken card, but a really annoying card that was just getting to that get probe kind of zone in my mind. And so that makes sense for it to go, causing like certain deck archetypes in Modern to become kind of a big gray blob. So I think that's good. And then Pioneer, I kind of screamed in my heart for a while.
They scream in your heart.
And listened to a bunch of people's podcasts where they were screaming not in their hearts.
See, I was impressed. We didn't scream. And re-listening to the episode, I was like, man, we were almost too tame. I think we could have had some hotter takes.
No, I don't think so.
Our language was terse.
Yeah. That was as hot as we get on the dive down. There's other people's brands you can go enjoy for angrier stuff than what Shane brought, the energy Shane brought last week.
Moderately terse energy.
Yeah, I mean, you're like a Scoville 5,000. You're not a Scoville 50,000 with your takes.
Okay.
That's okay. That's okay. We are the measured, confident, calm people.
Just happy to be here.
We're just happy to be here. Yeah, exactly.
Every week I'm amazed.
We are the calm voice of moderate annoyance.
Get us back on topic here, Dave.
Okay, so we are going to talk about Modern. That's where it started. I think it's interesting. Modern actually had a pretty big schedule last week. There were 7 non-league events that seemed to fire after the ban went into effect. There were 5 prelims, a challenge, and a super qualifier on this weekend that a lot of people had eyeballs on. That was a really cool event to see. I think before we hop into the meta, why don't we talk about what we thought might happen after the ban last week? Like what were the predictions that you guys had with the Astrolabe ban?
I mean, the primary thing I think, right, was, I mean, one of the primary things at least was its impact on Coatl, right? Because I think Coatl is a really powerful card in a lot of ways in these decks. It, replaces itself. It's a flash blocker death toucher, which it's a surprisingly good way to invalidate a lot of large creatures that have been really effective in Modern for a long time. So you look at things like Death Shadow or Gurmag Angler or Eldrazi creatures, and you're like, they don't really line up well against a Coatl. In addition, though, there's also the color fixing that Astrolabe provided as well. So it potentially could make it more difficult to run things like Archmage's Charm in greedy shells. Dead of Winter also was going to take a hit.
Yeah, Shane. I mean, I think what you're kind of speaking to is the fact that Coatl in Modern, in the Astrolabe decks, was basically Baleful Strix. Right? It was printed to be kind of like the more fixed Baleful Strix. And the reason that's good is because it's just a 2-mana 2-for-1. A, it replaces itself, and B, it trades with other creatures. And sometimes if you needed to maybe like carry a sword or just like swing in for a couple points of damage, sure, it does that too. But it trades profitably for 2 mana, more profitably than most 2 mana cards do.
Yeah, worth noting, Strix does not have flash. And so in some ways, Coatl was even more scary because you could just drop it, you could bluff it. Can't do that with Baleful Strix.
It's a replaceable removal spell.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways. And then it also has the power to fly over and plink down opposing planeswalkers. It just did so much in these snow decks. And of course, there's other impact from Astrolabe's ban, like maybe Urza decks wouldn't be quite as good, or Niv decks that rely on the mana fixing would also have an impact from the loss of the card. I think also, too, what people were looking for, there were some takes about what might be opened up from the loss of Astrolabe. Like, not only would it hurt the popular decks, but what might be more powerful now? And Ponza, of course, was already a deck that was still sticking around just fine and doing quite well. And now the concept was like, well, now maybe mana bases can be attacked more powerfully.
Yeah, and so I think most people were anticipating an uptick in Blood Moon, just in general, right? Blood Moon effects of Ponza, but also maybe Blue Moon goes back to being something that's more aggressively using Moon, things like that.
Yeah. And as Everett mentioned last week, Astrolabe really allowed the snow decks to play Field of Ruin, even though they were running like 3 color mana bases. And so people were maybe thinking, well, now is this time for Tron to reappear because they won't be as afraid of the mana impact? Of course, that's going to be counterbalanced by the prevalence and popularity of Ponza, which is going to play the land hate role now. I think people were still thinking that an Uro mid-rangey type deck would likely still be pretty good. And I think we'll talk about what we saw Uro appear in our results.
Yeah, I mean, I was tweeting from the Dive Down account on ban day, so I feel like there's a written record of what some of my predictions were for the post-ban metagame, but I essentially thought that Stoneforge Mystic was going to get better because now control decks didn't necessarily have to run Uro to be their best threat. They can also just run that Stoneforge package again. I definitely thought Blood Moon was going to get better. I didn't necessarily anticipate that Blue Moon was going to start main decking Blood Moons again, but that checks out. I guess I'm not surprised. I think the thing I wasn't expecting for, which we're going to talk about a little bit, is just that Jund maintained its popularity and maybe even got more popular this week.
Does Jund's popularity ever actually surprise you? It's just that people just like it. I think they like the concept of optionality. I think they like the concept of playing the hand disruption and playing the removal spells and just having the options to do what they want and just win the Jund game plans. I'm never surprised to see it.
Yeah, I mean, here's just like a little brief tease. Jund was the most popular deck in week 1 of post-ban Modern. But not by a wide margin, but it was. And I think perhaps what may be happening is when control is not in tier 1, as Bant Snow had been, and control being a strategy that can beat up on mid-rangey Jund strategies, that does actually create like a little bit of extra space for Jund to maybe pick apart some of the other aggro or mid-range players that are trying to, exploit whatever is happening in the metagame in week 1.
So let's not tease it anymore. Stan, you did a lot of tables. You did a lot of pivot tables. Why don't you take us through what the metagame looked like? Now, just as a reminder, we looked at events that were non-league events. So these were only tournaments where we could see frequency-based results, right? So these are prelims, challenges, and the super qualifier where we can see people's records, where they placed, but also we can see if there's more than one of the same deck in the tournament, as opposed to with the league where you can't see that.
This is kind of like one of our classic and semi-frequent things where we're saying, like, what's the competitive metagame looking like? Like, so it's not just kind of like a MTG Goldfish thing where they incorporate leagues and competitive data. We're saying, like, what's appearing in top 32s, what's appearing in the 3-2 or better lists in the prelims, and let's get a competitive metagame in terms of both performance and in popularity.
For sure. And what I did was I took the MTG Goldfish data from the post-ban prelims and the top 32s that MTG Goldfish posted from the weekend's events. I put them into a spreadsheet. All the data stands out there. I made some pivot tables. And here's what I've got. Oh, and I guess I want to add one more thing. I looked at all of the raw data that we have, and then I also looked at what I call the winners metagame. So I'm going to talk about the raw data, and then I'm going to talk about the decks that only went 5-0, 4-1, or made top 8 over the weekend, if that makes sense.
Totally makes sense. That's awesome.
Just to narrow the perspective a little bit. So 31 different decks in Modern, give or take. So there's some minor variations there, like Mono Red Prowess, Izzet Prowess, and I guess Boros Prowess, which is just Mono Red Prowess with Boros Charm. Those all came in as 3 different decks.
And Mardu Luris Aggro, which is basically Rakdos Prowess as well.
And just how different are Infect and Tron, really, Stan?
Hey, you're just asking the questions.
One thing I wanted to mention before you look at this table, Stan, is just the grand total number of separate decks that are accounted for in this table are 134 different entries. So every number that Stan gives out, if you want to think about it in a percentage The denominator is 134.
Dave, did you know that you could flip percentage calculations around? Did you know this? This is like, so 33% of 6 is the same as 6% of 33.
Thanks, Shane. All right, so of these decks, we have 4 different strategies that had more than 10 copies across the week. In first place with 13 copies was red, black, green, mid-range. I believe it's a Yund. It's a soft J.
Jund.
All right, so Jund, 13 copies. But right behind it, Gruul mid-range, aka Ponza, with 12, as well as Eldrazi with 12, which I think you can look at that as 3 mid-range decks were among the most popular in the metagame.
I would have guessed that Etron was at the top of the metagame just from my experience over the last couple of weeks and from watching the challenge over the weekend. So I'm surprised to see Jund at the top. But Etron and Ponza both make a lot of sense for me as far as like what my personal experience looks like recently.
Yeah, totally. Like Etron suffered nothing from losing Astrolabe. If anything, maybe they gained something because now a lot of Etron players are no longer running Chalice of the Void, making room for Mazemind Tome instead. So we'll see whether that sticks. But maybe, losing Astrolabe actually helped Etron gain some fresh new technology.
Well, and as like I mentioned earlier, there's also like the threat of Coatl, just pinging down like your Thought-Knot Seer or something like that, where you're attacking these large, somewhat expensive creatures into open mana, and they just death touch it, and you're like, well, poop.
Yeah, so there's your top 3. Now there's one more deck in that above 10 entries that Stan mentioned. What is it, Stan?
11 copies of Izzet Blitz.
I'm sorry?
Izzet, it's a blue-red color pair.
Blizzit It's?
Yeah, so it's like a mono-red Prowess deck, but it's splashing blue for Stormwing Entity. You might like that card, Dave. You should check it out.
I have a lot to say about this that maybe we'll talk about later.
Yeah, maybe.
Man, was this a surprise to me. I had definitely seen over I was not playing a ton while I was on vacation, but I played immediately before I left and a bunch right after I came back the last couple of days. And I definitely noted the deck's increase in popularity, but I was not expecting the counter of this deck to be quite as high.
At the time of recording, Izzet Blitz is the most popular modern deck according to MTG Goldfish.
Another thing that blew my mind this morning when I looked there, I was like, what?
Did they call this deck Red Blitz before and now it's Izzet Blitz? Or wasn't it Mono Red Prowess?
They still call it Mono Red Blitz on Goldfish I don't know why. I hate that they call it Blitz. It's Prowess. These are Prowess decks.
I really love that game for N64, NFL Blitz.
Yeah, it's a classic arcade. I mean, it's no NBA Jam, but it does have its own unique feel.
It's no Tecmo Bowl, but
for sure. Some other very popular decks with 9 copies was Goblins. So Bogart, David Harbinger, putting in work. Blue-White Control also had 9 copies.
Blue-White Control. Like, who was expecting that to make such a resurgence? Like,
Everett was last week. I mean, wasn't he talking about his Sharkblade deck?
Well, I mean, this is Everett we're talking about, right? Like, Everett's always like, yeah, like my cool control deck is going to make a resurgence because control is very good. But
guess what? Somebody else took it to second place in the challenge.
Yeah, I mean, this is good stuff. I mean, it's people like control, right? Just like they like mid-range.
They like it so much that the next deck on the list is Sultai Control.
Well, that's really like our Uro deck now, right?
Correct.
The Sultai Control. That's just Sultai Snow. I mean, I don't know if you guys have a lot to say about this, but I was just like, how is this still doing what it's doing? Like, it has like Thought Scour sometimes in place of Astrolabe, but it's like they're running the 3 blue mana spells. They have Triomes, Fetches, and Shocks, and I guess that's enough.
They're also doing something slightly different, is they're all playing Wilderness Reclamation and Nexus of Fate.
Well, I saw that a little bit. I did not see that a lot bit.
I don't think they all are, and maybe our sample size led it to that, but there are some playing that. But like, for example, I watched Gabriel Nassif over the weekend playing Sultai Control, who did not have that as his closer in the deck either.
Yeah, I think that's the exception, not the rule.
Yeah, almost none of the Sultai decks that I played against in the last week have had that. One had that I played, but I think I played against it 3 or 4 times. 3 times.
This
probably.
is looking like the same deck, really, right? It's like, Ice Fang Coatls and Uros and some Jaces and a bunch of removal and counter magic and even Dead of Winter. I mean, the card that we earlier said people were thinking we would lose some steam.
Yeah, it's not good anymore. I don't think after watching Nassif stream with it, during the challenge or the super qualifier, it's just like it's a little too restrictive. You're not getting your basics out as much. It's often only -3, which is good for some situations, but not good for lots. And I don't think that that's going to make it. Maybe that's just a change that's incoming. But I do want to ask you all, if this deck looks mostly the same, is that a bad thing? Is that an okay thing?
I mean, so it's a good thing, right? Like if the idea of a ban like this is clearly not to eliminate the deck. This is not like a Mox Opal if Affinity was 58% win rate. This is designed just to sort of take things down a peg, make things a little bit less free, make things a little bit less consistent, and that's probably where we want to be, right? I think that you typically want decks to continue existing for people who like the play patterns and who like the play style, and allow them to keep doing their thing.
Yeah. I also think it's pretty cool that the fetch shock mana base that they have to play now, in addition to a bunch of snow basics, allows them to splash for black to run Assassin's Trophy and Fatal Push. I think Sultai Control is a strategy that people for a long time in Modern have kind of wanted to see it work out, and the printing of Assassin's Trophy felt like it might lead to that a little bit, and now perhaps we're seeing the early stages of that really coming to fruition.
Yeah. I mean, this deck was good the last few weeks already and was definitely around. Like, a lot of people have been advocating it before the Astrolabe ban, and I'm glad that it's still there. There's this pivot going on in that blue-green shell with, like, what color do you want to play with it? You know, do you want to play white? And so the Bant lists are farther down here. Last time I talked on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, there were a lot of Teamer Uro decks floating around, Teamer Snow kind of decks floating around with Ren and 6 and Lightning Bolt. And those seem to have completely fallen by the wayside, at least in this particular weekend. They weren't as popular. But I think what's maybe happening is Sultai is emerging as the one that's the best one out of that group. Because in most cases, Fatal Push and a removal suite of Fatal Push, Abrupt Decay, and Assassin's Trophy is going to get a lot of work done for you. Okay, so there was one more deck that was above 5 in your sample of 134 decks.
And that was Grixis Death Shadow.
We're back.
Goodie but goodie.
Is that kind of like where Death Shadow has been for a while? Sort of like tier 2-ish, like low tier 2-ish, just sort of hanging on, being a player, but not being crazy. It seems like what I remember it being.
I think it has some important upgrades in it lately. I've been seeing the decks slow down a little bit by not playing Mishra's Bauble, but playing more interactive and mid-rangey spells. Cling to Dust seems to be a main deckable staple now, since it's just like draws you a card. It's relevant in a bunch of matchups these days to just like nab something out of an opponent's graveyard if they target it with their Mystic Sanctuary, or if they, tap out for an Uro on turn 3. Royal Scion seems to be a one-of staple. Sometimes there's extra copies in the sideboard to basically be your extra copies of Teamer Battle Rage that can also help you grind a little bit. And of course, Drown in the Lock. I think having this versatile counterspell / removal spell that sometimes maybe if post-board you're taking out your Gurmag Anglers because you're afraid of graveyard hate, you can start pointing your Thought Scours at the opponent to feed your Drown in the Lock. There could be some game there.
Yeah. I just think it's adapted, to the metagame, and now it's ready to come back. There were a number of different Death Shadow decks that popped up in different ways. There's 4-color. There was a little bit of Jund Death Shadow. It looks like there's only one of each of those. So Death Shadow is out there. I think you're right, Shane. It's kind of always going to be in that playable tier very often. I think that also it thrives in a non-broken metagame, and what we have right now is a non-broken metagame. Good players can play well with Death Shadow.
One of our patrons says something that I thought was really astute this week. We were talking about whether or not Grixis Shadow was, a safe deck to buy into, whether it would be viable in Modern in general, maybe in the short to long term. And I'm sorry, I can't remember exactly who said it, but it stuck with me, which is Shadow has kind of earned its place next to Infect, Tron, Jund, etc. as a pillar of the format that can, regardless of the circumstances in a metagame, can always maybe sit at the table. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing now, especially in these week 1 metagames where people are really figuring out what is or isn't the strongest thing in the format, these really powerful pillars that have been doing strong things for years now can continue to, earn wins for the pilots who know how to play them.
Yeah, and I don't want to give anything away, but if you look at the conversion rate of Death Shadow decks from the general meta into Stan's personal winners meta, there's 4 Death Shadow decks in the winners meta. So half of the Death Shadow decks that made it into our report made it into the winners meta as well. Now, some of that is the pilots. The person who came in the top 8 of the super is super well-known streamer Ben Jones, and he is one of the huge advocate of Death Shadow, and took it almost all the way to the house. So
we can talk about not quite a top 10 but a top 11 decks if we include the decks that put up 5 copies into our listicle of results. 5 copies each was Mono Red Blitz, Blue Red Storm, and Ad Nauseum.
So that's 16 aggressive Prowess style decks then, which would kind of be the number one if we incorporated like archetype styles.
Oh, it's not only 16. There's also 2 more in the red-black zone, and there's a red-white one. And so it's really 19 in my mind.
Go fast.
Yeah. And it shows in the sense that if you look at the number 1 played creature in this kind of metagame sample that we have, it's not Uro anymore. It is Monastery Swiftspear.
The singer from Nashville herself.
Mm-hmm. Mona Swift.
Likewise, the most popular card, which appeared 239 times, was Lightning Bolt. Swiftspear appeared 92 times.
Yeah. Lightning Bolt was far and away the most played card in this sample of decks. We had a grand total from Goldfish of 1,320 cards that we reported out on, and Lightning Bolt was 239 of those samples, basically. The curve falls off so quickly. Our number 1 card is 239. Aether Gust was the number 2 card at 112. Monastery Swiftspear was at 92. Opt was at 88. And then from there, it's all downhill, 70, 60, 50, down to 20 really fast from there. Everybody loves Lightning Bolt right now.
Card is good. I've been saying this for a while. 1 mana, 3 damage, any target. Hello.
Still great.
See, I just keep putting like Healing Salve in my decks, and it's just not doing the same thing. Just not doing it.
I keep trying to put Ancestral Recall in my decks, and then it's telling me that it's not legal. I don't get it.
That's unusual. It's all part of the same cycle.
So when we look at this list of 31 decks, it's all pretty familiar. A lot of your staples. You have your Scape Shifts, your Titan decks, Humans and Tron, etc. You got classic Burn. You even have Vexing Devil, Chandra's Incinerator styles of Burn. The outliers, as I can tell, is Spirits, still missing. Hardened Scales, however, present. And then I'm trying to think of, what else is missing from this list. And I feel like almost everything that we would expect from Modern is represented. No Dice Factory, I guess.
It's been a minute for Dice Factory.
And one of the things that surprised me a little bit was the lack of performance by Greentron. I saw a lot of streamers facing down Greentron decks in the leagues, at least. I think people were testing Greentron and being like, can I play this again? Is Greentron going to be a deck that can just be successful in an uncertain meta? And I don't think we have a lot of evidence to show that this is the case.
I should add, one of the other absences is Urza. I don't think I saw a single copy of Urza, the card, or the deck.
Yeah, that is really shocking, actually, because I'm not sure why Astrolabe on its own would be enough to make that happen, but maybe it is. I don't know if it's just that I don't know. Usually you see a couple of at least combo Urza decks popping up in a sample like this, but not this time.
Yeah, maybe losing both Opal and Astrolabe was enough to just make it too slow for anyone who tried to play it. Maybe, who knows? No one played it. Stranger things have happened.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it is a limited sample of 7 events, So
in terms of the winners metagame, this doesn't pull out who won what we can talk about that too if we want. But I kind of wanted to get a snapshot of the decks that did really well. So again, these are decks that made top 8 over the weekend or went at least 4-1 during a prelim. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
We have 37 different decks here, and the most common among these is blue-white control.
Wow.
With 5 copies.
Well, we have 37 total decks.
Yes. Yeah, thank you.
But like, what, 16 different decks?
16 or 17, give or take.
Yeah, who counts? Not me.
We counta, though.
Count A.
Can we have like an Excel digression for a sec? Like, what does that mean? Does that mean anything?
It's different than count. So it's like count A is like count the number of times that like a term appears, right, Stan? Versus like total. Like count is usually like similar to a total, correct? I'm probably spewing something a little bit wrong.
You know, I know how to work Excel. I don't know what any of these words mean.
You know what I'm feeling coming on here? The longest thread of comments we've ever had on Reddit is going to be about this discussion about spreadsheets.
I welcome it.
Yeah, bring it. Okay, Stan, so these Azorius control decks, do you have a sense of what anything that unifies them or anything that's kind of different about them this time? Like I mentioned earlier, I know that the second place deck in the Super Qualifier was Everett's Sharkblade deck. I don't think that showed up in other places necessarily, but not sure if there's anything in particular interesting about why Azorius Control is here now and eschewing Uro and being successful.
So, although they're not all playing Stoneforges, Shark Typhoon is popping up a lot. For instance, like the 4-1 list from the prelim on July 16th has 3 copies of Shark Typhoon in there.
Mm-hmm.
Likewise, I'm seeing a lot of frantic inventories.
Yeah. I gotta say something here about Frantic Inventory, because I don't know if you remember, that was one of the preview cards that I kind of led the write-up for on our preview episode for M21. And what I have to say to Frantic Inventory is, I'm sorry.
You better apologize, Dave.
I mean, I've faced it down a bunch of times now, and I've definitely noticed over the last couple of weeks that it's popping up more and more in these pure control lists. I didn't think that you would hit it with enough frequency to have it be worth it, but turns out that the way to make it work is to just draw a bunch of cards using it and other card draw to draw more copies of it so that you draw more cards off of it. And it actually combos really well as just another option in your deck with Mystic Sanctuary, because it can let you cast the same Frantic Inventory many times, which happened to me when I was playing against a blue-red deck the other night, who I think cast the same Frantic Inventory against me 3 times.
Sick. Ban it. The Stoneforge Mystic was not exclusive to Everett's deck. Both of the top 8 blue-white control decks from the Challenge and the Super Qualifier had Stoneforge Mystics and Shark Typhoons. They didn't all have Frantic Inventory, though. Neither of them did. So that may be something that people are still testing. But I've said it before, I'm just going to say it again. Like, I think Shark Typhoon has kind of proved itself as a really good threat and way to spend mana at instant speed in control strategies. Whether it's blue-white, maybe even in like blue-red decks and beyond. I think this is just like a great way to hold up interaction. And if you have nothing to use interaction on, you get to draw a card and put a body down.
And it also provides finishing power. Like it's a real finisher. Like Everett was mentioning last week, if you eventually get to it, you can stick one as opposed to cycling it. You logic not for a huge amount. You have a bunch of spells that you're casting towards the end game, and you're getting value off it. So you're going wide, which is something that control decks have never had truly legitimate ways to do, going wide with like 3/3s and 4/4s instead of 1/1 tokens or something like that.
Yeah, it's kind of like, what if Sphinx's Revelation only drew you 1 card and put a 10/10 into play instead of drew you a bunch of cards
and gained you some life.
Yeah, although it's good at low. That's the card I think of when I think about a giant X spell in blue-white control. You know what I mean? And part of me goes like, well, why wouldn't we just try out Sphinx's Revelation now? And the reason is because this is much better at lower casting costs than Revelation is, in my opinion.
You know, also some of these blue-white decks, they're not playing main deck Wraths anymore, right? They're going all in on counter magic, really. They have the Path to Exiles, of course, but you've got a ton of counter magic, and then like Teferi and Jace they can help you get a body off the board if you need to. I wonder if like the enchantment side of Shark Typhoon is also a decent spell to tap out for if you have Force of Negation in hand, so that if your opponent tries to do something with the fact that you've spent all of your mana, if you do have Force of Negation up, you could potentially leave behind a 3/3 while also countering whatever your opponent might be doing if they're, doing a non-creature spell.
Maybe.
Something to think about.
Yeah. I haven't seen anyone do that yet, but maybe.
Yeah, maybe they're just never casting the enchantment. Okay, moving on to the rest of our winners meta. In second place with 4 copies, surprise, surprise, it's Eldrazi-tron.
And Eldrazi-tron was the winning deck of the Super Qualifier, piloted by Tunneling Cat. She's a well-known streamer, been doing a lot of Eldrazi-tron lately, and also one of the trophy leaders in this season, and I think last season as well. So this is someone who's put a ton of work into Eldrazi-tron and landed it. So,
and they were playing the Chalice of the Void version. No tomes here.
I still think it's crazy in a world of Blitz style Prowess decks being the most prevalent decks here that E-Tron would consider not running Chalice of the Void.
It was actually running both Chalice and Mazemind Tome.
Yeah, the thing we should say is that Mazemind Tome replaces Mind Stone, not Chalice of the Void. A lot of the Chalice of the Void less decks are because some Eldrazi-tron players decided that it was better to just up their threat density. And so they were doing things like putting Wormcoil Engine in the main and stuff like that. And so I think that's what the trade-off more so is. Agree with Shane, though, that, I think that there was a moment towards the 10 days ago, maybe, or towards the beginning of last week where Prowess was not looking that popular, and neither were a couple of other decks that often fall to Chalice of the Void, so people were cheating and taking them out a little bit. I don't think you can do that anymore. I like Shane said, I don't know why you would play Eldrazi-tron and not play Chalice at this point, especially if Prowess is looking that good where all you want to do in Prowess is cast 1 mana spells. So,
Dave, after playing a little bit of Prowess, can it even beat E-Tron?
Yeah, absolutely. You have to do some contortions. You have to get some threats down early and stuff like that, but you can absolutely beat it because your spells don't have to resolve in order for Prowess to resolve. And so if you can get some damage in early and then keep racing and have them not kill any of your threats, which is totally possible, you can still win.
Third most successful deck was Jund. And likewise, Izzet, Blitz, and Ponza, all 3 of these put up 3 copies in our winners bracket.
Yep.
Love it.
Good decks, more or less, besides Jund, which is a fine deck.
Is now a good time to just talk about Izzet, Blitz actually and why they're splashing blue and what Stormwing actually brings to the table?
Yeah. Yeah, if we want to talk about it now, we could, we're just going to use up my content from later about what I've been doing.
Let's just have Dave talk about it later.
Okay.
Don't spoil it.
I don't want to sound disappointed, but I kind of feel like the winners metagame is it's a little plain in that it's all of our usual friends. Goblins feels like the most surprising deck here.
You know what's sneakily been around? Just lower tier 2, always ready to strike. And that's Infect lately. I think you can't sleep on Infect right now. I don't know exactly why. But Infect has been hanging around. It's no longer silly to run. It's no longer a funny thing to show up now and then.
I think Infect is not good right now. If there is this much Prowess floating around, Infect I think is super bad against Prowess because I have infinity ways to deal one damage to a creature for free or 2 times with a card or things like that. So I think it feels pretty rough to me in that meta game, and Prowess does tend to just take it out.
I don't think this is the kind of deck. I don't think people can bring Infect and hope to cheese out as many wins as they can with a Prowess deck, right? I could take a Prowess deck to a tournament in day 2 with it, potentially. You know what I mean? If I'm running well. I'm not saying anyone can. I'm not saying Shane, the Joker is going to just automatically day 2 a deck, day 2 with that deck, right? But I think Infect is a type of deck that has enough sheer power that in a pilot who's sequencing well and knows how to use all these protection effects and growth effects and things like that could likely outplay a more average like red prowess player. And they would have to if they're going to win in this meta. But I'm not in the hands of a certain player. I think you'd be better off doing red prowess than infect. Yes.
I also think that with Jund this much around, like fatal push is not great to see on the as the infect player.
I know.
You know what I mean? So
I'm not saying take infect, Dave. Okay.
Okay. What were you saying then?
I'm saying that infect is around and you should be aware of it.
You should definitely be aware that it can kill you on like turn 2 if you're not careful.
Dave, I want to talk really quick about this hypothetical prowess infect matchup because I actually think it's a very nuanced matchup since on the one hand, prowess has 24 spells that deal exactly 1 damage, but infect has just as many spells that get you out of gut shot range plus spell skite.
Yeah, but here's the thing is that it all comes down to the first couple of turns, and prowess can cast extra spells in the first couple of turns that and infect can't do that. You know what I mean? Like infect isn't really running now tell me if I'm wrong. I don't believe that infect is running mutagenic growth, for example. Right?
Sure is.
Oh, it is? Okay. Yeah, I'm looking at a list now.
I think the main deck spell skites are a thing, Stan. They're back.
Yeah.
Like Modern Infect is definitely saying like I'm gonna run spell skite, it's gonna save my bacon.
Yeah. But even like any one of your infect creatures, I can immediately point like lava dart. I can point a lava dart at it. You can try to play the pump spell. The pump spell wears off, and then on your turn, I just lava dart it again. You know, or I gut shot it and then I lava dart it. Like this is the type of thing that I feel like is just kind of like when there's 20 decks out of 130, I wouldn't want to be playing infect.
Yeah, you're asking for trouble. You're asking to dodge some matchups.
Yeah. I think the killer in this matchup is Soulscar Mage because sure you can spend your mutagenic growth to get out of lava dart range, but that lava dart is just going to get you.
I didn't need to make such a multi-minute digression on infect.
Yeah, why don't you join us for our infect podcast sometime? I mean, infect is a fine deck, but I'm just saying that particular matchup would make me really worried right now with how prevalent it is.
That wraps up this week's episode of The Groundswell.
Yeah, The Groundswell.
So, we talked about the top of the modern metagame. We do cover another format. Let's jump over to Pioneer, unless you guys have anything else you want to say about modern results.
No, sounds good. So, Oath of Nissa was unbanned, right? And people were kind of like, maybe we'll see some Kethis. Maybe we'll see some Green Devotion do something. But the events are actually firing a little bit. So we have some stuff to talk about here, right? So that's good. Has anything changed? And I think it's the same meta. We don't have too much different here. We have.
Are we surprised by that?
No.
Like, I mean, it's not like anybody really thought something was going to change after this, right?
I think the only thing that would have been potentially feasible is Kethis being like a near tier 1 deck, maybe like a high tier 2 or something like that. And in our current metagame that we are exploring, we don't see that. There was a single Kethis combo out of 69 decks. So
also worth noting, our sample here is
a little weird.
Is 5 events.
Yeah.
1 challenge and 4 prelims. And all of the prelims still have less decks than the modern prelims had in them. So our sample of deck count, raw deck count, is half the size of the one from the modern pivot table that Stan just did.
Yeah, a little unfortunate. So we have Dimir Inverter with 13, Mono Black Aggro with 12, Mono White, Lotus Breach with 9 and 8. It's the same stuff.
It's almost just like somebody wrote it up that way. Right.
Yeah, like we could have likely just predicted this metagame with the red aggro decks slightly behind and the burn decks and spirits and stuff like that. And then we have a smattering of like 2 and 1-ofs of random things. The thing that I think I would take from this immediately is the mono black aggro is now very in vogue instead of vampires. The vampires is only a 1-of where there are 12 mono black, kind of the traditional mono black aggro decks. So vampires was maybe a little bit more popular than even traditional mono black, but now it seems like the tables have sort of spun around, and we're back to the mono black being it's just tier 1 now. And I think there's a couple reasons that mono black aggro is even better than ever, perhaps, that I want to get into later when we kind of dive into some interesting nuances and some subtle changes in some of these decks.
So just really quick, we touched on how smaller sample size was because of the amount of events that we had to look at. One of the things that, stuck out to me in Pioneer versus Modern is that we also have fewer decks to look at. So only 18 different decks, give or take, with, some very subtle variations. Though those blurred lines are fewer in Pioneer than they are in Modern. But
great song, by the way.
Love that song. 18 different decks appeared across all of these events. The total deck count is 69, which is pretty nice, but the actual variety is significantly smaller. We also have, most popular cards, but we'll get into that in a minute.
Yeah, and there's a clear top 4 that Shane mentioned a minute ago. Dimir Inverter, Mono Black Aggro, Mono White Devotion, Lotus Breach, and then it falls off to kind of a lower tier of occurrence.
Yeah. There's like a clear tier 1 and what I would say is a clear tier 2 and then a very big tier 3.
Yeah.
Which is typically something that you might think is okay, but just the percentages here are not really what we want to be seeing. And people are just honestly tired of seeing Dimir Inverter at the top because it just skews the metagame around it, and you have to be prepared to beat it and prepared to play against it. At least try to hold your own. And that just continues to be an area of frustration for people, I think.
Fascinating to me that there is no Uro deck in this sample, really.
There's no Simic Delirium.
Yeah. Anyway, so we were starting to talk about Mono Black Aggro because that's the one that's the newish one in the top tier, or a returning one at the top tier. So why do you think Mono Black is happening suddenly again?
What's weird is Demonic Embrace is now a interesting staple. 1, 2, I think I might have even seen a few 3-ofs in some of these lists. And Demonic Embrace is a new card from Core Set 21. It's 1 black enchantment. So it sounds expensive, right? It gives a creature +3/+1 and flying. Can also be cast from the graveyard by paying 3 life and discarding a card. So we know how synergistic discarding cards can be in Mono Black Aggro. It gives you something to do with excess lands. It lets you pitch cards that can then recur from the graveyard, like a number of your creatures can. It amps up your low CMC creatures into some big threats. So you stick this on a Bloodsoaked Champion, you have a flying 5 attack creature, and even if it dies, you can recur that enchantment back from the graveyard along with recurring the Bloodsoaked Champion. So it's just a really good way to provide long game and even immediate on, say, turn 3, a flying attacking power to really get your opponent dead. It can do a little bit like that Smuggler's Copter Impression, which I think is pretty valuable. It's nowhere near the same card, of course, but it does a lot of the things that you would want it to do just with the synergistic aspects there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those things, too, where it's more flying in the deck that didn't have like a ton of flying before, and it's recurring flying. I mean, there was Rankle and there was Spawn of Mayhem, so it had access to that, but to me, it's just a reminder that flying is the best keyword, and it's always nice to be able to just go over your opponents.
And speaking of flying and going over your opponents, Spawn of Mayhem is also making a comeback in these decks. And that was something that we saw become more popular back when Mono Black Aggro was like the tier 1 deck to beat, because it's the Rankle Stopper. It's like the Mirror Breaker. So you play this, it's the 4/4 flyer that's stopping the 3/3 flyer in Rankle. And also, interestingly, when you're getting your 2-power creatures up to 5 power with Demonic Embrace, you're also able then to stop the opposing Spawn of Mayhems. You're able to stop the opposing Rankles. So there's a lot of kind of leveling even in the Mono Black Aggro deck.
Yeah, the thing that I love about Embrace, when I first read it was templated almost like a force card, one of the force cycles in Modern or Force of Will or whatever. But the fact that you're actually discarding a card to bring back Demonic Embrace in a deck full of like Scrap Heap Scroungers and Dread Wanderers, you don't actually, necessarily 2-for-1 yourself nearly as often as you would otherwise, unless perhaps opponents playing like instant speed Graveyard Hate and they cling to dust you.
Yeah, it's good. Do you want to talk about the winning metagame right now, or do you want me to kind of go into some interesting changes I noticed?
Let's, we have this tier 1. Can we talk really quick about what's tier 2 and the big tier 3 and maybe some absences?
Sure. It's interesting. There's still the split between mono red aggro and burn, and I think that's a fair split on Goldfish's part, because burn is lower to the ground, it plays more burn spell, and mono red aggro is more sort of creature based and creature synergy based, and sometimes can go into a more of a mid-range construction. And I think it's fair to split those two out, but there's still, that's kind of the deck that's trying to be aggressive enough to get under some of the combo decks, and also probably take out like mono white devotion. If you're plinking off those white creatures, you're not allowing Heliod to get on. You also have burn to take care of things like walking ballista, so that's valuable.
The big difference between these two decks, just to like level set a little bit, burn is Boros ostensibly, right? It runs Boros Charm because it's good to deal 4 damage at instant speed. The mono red aggro list,
I've heard that,
plays the prowess creatures. It plays Monastery Swift Spear and Soulscar Mage, where they both do. I'm sorry, I was just looking at it. The main thing is that the mono red aggro deck tops out at Torbran, and the burn deck, of course, does not, because it's all lower stuff. And some of the lists in burn still run Luris as well as a companion to be able to bring stuff back.
Yeah, because you have your creatures sort of frequently have either haste or ETBs.
But in a funny way, those first 4 decks are like the good black cards, the good blue cards, the good white cards, and some of the good green cards. And then the next tier is like, hey, there's all these red cards that are also pretty good that are in Pioneer. Here's the decks that those go into.
Azorius Spirits is making a little bit of a comeback. It's still solidly tier 2-ish. I think one of the reasons for that is the Lofty Denial that we've been talking about. It's just a straight up playset.
Oh yeah,
all the time now, right? In 2 of the 4, and also in 2 of the 4 of these decks in the results, we see Watcher of the Spheres finally making some appearances. That's that blue-white 2/2 flying bird wizard. So it's not a spirit, but it makes creatures with flying cost 1 generic less to cast, and then it gets a little 1/1 boost for the turn every time a creature with flying ETBs. So it's synergistic, and we talked about how it might have synergy with the deck, and I think people are experimenting with it.
Yeah, and don't forget, a lot of these decks are running Shacklegeist as well as an additional way to tap down your opponent's board once things really get going. So there is some cool new stuff going on in Azorius Spirits. I also noticed that a number of these decks are running a really weird card called Beckon Apparition, which is a 1 mana instant main deck graveyard hate that puts a 1/1 spirit token into play. So guessing that's some kind of like anti-Uro tech or other things. There's just a lot of cards that it's useful against.
Yeah, I'm loving this Azorius Spirit list, and I feel like the only thing I can really infer from the fact that Bant Spirits is absent, but Azorius Spirits is present with several copies, is that having those 4 extra copies of what is very often Counterspell is so much more important than whatever Coco's providing.
Yeah, they must just be better than against Inverter, right?
Yeah, totally. And I feel like I said this a couple weeks ago, where it's like the way to beat Inverter is you kind of need 2 Counterspells. And now they have 8 between your Lofty Denials and the Spell Quellers. And then you also have like some aggressive game plans with Rally of Wings, if that's your jam as well.
That's a big pump spell.
Oh, yeah. And then kind of lagging behind that is the other stuff, right? And that can be stuff from, we did see a couple Green Devotion decks that I want to talk about. Niv to Light is making a little bit of an appearance here. Just random decks that, I know one thing you wanted to talk about later is this cycling deck, Dave, sort of cycling control. We do see a Winota deck. We do see that Mono Black Vampires. We do see our Singleton Kethis combo. Even stuff like Boros Feather, Esper Control, and Golgari Stompy still showing up as one of. So we want Pioneer to be the play what you like format, but in terms of competitive viability, I don't think we're quite there yet. Or people are bringing what they consider to be the best decks and trying to out meta each other with some tweaks and tech in those lists.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, since you just brought it up, is that what you want Pioneer to be? Do you want Pioneer to be the play what you want format? Because here's what I kind of want it to be. I want it to be a format where creature combat is good.
Yes.
Like that's kind of the thing that I'm interested in.
Yeah, that's kind of what I think people liked. Many people seem to like about Pioneer is that its board is very to the board, right? And it's about thinking about your combat. The humans players of the world probably really liked Pioneer. It's probably why I like Pioneers. I like playing to the board, and I like thinking about how to generate a good board, take advantage of that, make cool attacks, bluff, things like that. And I would agree, Dave, which is that was kind of Pioneer's identity early on, right? Is it's battlefield based,
and now
it's not.
Yeah.
Now
it is if you're mono black aggro.
It's a very healthy format with a lot of diversity in the metagame.
And there are clearly many interesting decks that are just ready to take over the Dimir Inverter meta.
Yeah, I will say we should keep in mind that like standard, and I've said this before, this is not justification for where Pioneer is right now, but standard often only has a handful of decks. And modern often has a lot of decks. And so the fact that Pioneer is sort of something in between, I don't think should be too surprising to us. It's just that the decks that have settled on the top of this particular metagame in a non-rotating format are not fun, not incentivizing to want to play against, and there's not enough churn going on. Like the thing that happens with modern is that modern turns, right? The wheel turns and a different type. Like one thing that wasn't anywhere really in the results this week is Titan in modern. There's like no Titan decks. That's not going to last forever. It's not like Titan's bad suddenly. It's going to be bad for 6 months. Something's going to happen. The wheel's going to turn and a different deck's going to be on top of the meta. It's not happening in Pioneer, really.
And good standards, well-designed standards in the past have also been heavy churn.
Well, it's a lot harder to do in a standard metagame, though. And I think that it's sort of unreasonable to ask that of WotC with standard cards, with the standard size pool, to have that always happen. But in an Eternal format, we need it. It's not happening. And there are a lot of sweet cards that people want to play that people are trying to play anyway. It's not happening. So please reconsider the things that you have done recently, WotC.
Or don't. So I do want to point out a couple cool decks in this overall snapshot. So one is our Naya Winota friend. There's some new tech that has been popping up a lot in Pioneer Winota. I've been seeing a lot of Tithe Takers, which is 1 and a white human soldier. So this is another card to get off of your Winota trigger, or you can just play it on curve, which is, during your turn, spells your opponents cast cost 1 more to cast, and abilities cost 1 more to activate. It also has Afterlife 1. I'm also seeing P and Kieran pop up, which I think is really cool. Another great human to get off your Winota triggers that leaves several bodies behind. They're not playing that white 5-color Commander King.
Kenrith,
thank you. So I when we did our Naya dive, I was really positive about this deck, and I was really impressed by how quickly it can achieve kills in Pioneer. Apparently not quick enough to hang with the top dogs yet, but I do love to see that there's some internal churn within some of these strategies. It's even playing Garruk's David Harbinger, which is a M21 card, 1 green for a beast that's got hexproof from black.
Mm-hmm.
That has a bunch of text I'm not going to read. The other card I want to call out, just because I don't think we've really talked about it yet, but it's been popping up a lot, which is this Rakdos Unearth style deck.
Yeah.
And I don't know why, this is entirely conjecture, but when WotC said we're seeing new interesting decks pop up that can potentially have positive win rates against the combo strategies, I kind of wondered whether this mid-rangey Black-Red Unearth deck could do it, because it has the Thoughtseize, it has a bunch of removal, it has main deck Planeswalker hate with Dreadbore, but it also has this Luris package with Archfiend's Vessel and Stitcher Supplier and Croxa and Young Pyromancers.
Yeah, we should mention this deck piloted in our sample by Phil Hellmuth, who's a well-known streamer, quite often places in challenges, and so it's a player who I respect, like their deck selection, and it definitely makes me go, so they believe in this kind of thing. It feels a lot like Mardu Pyromancer to me in some ways. I haven't played it, but when I look at the cards, I'm like, is it that same kind of zone where you're like, you get to go a little wide if you want to, you get to have a big resilient threat in Croxa if you want to. There's this fun kind of combo with a bunch of the cards in the deck with Claim to Fame as well, where it's like, oh, you can bring cards back with that. You can bring back an Archfiend's Vessel and give your 5/5 guy haste, I think, with it. Potentially, maybe not. Maybe that's not the way that the triggers work out.
Yeah.
I think you can't do it. Yeah, with after.
I think so.
Yeah.
It's also running the best card from Core Set 2021, which is Village Rites. So
I mean, I did want to bring it up because it's running the Village Rites card, and it's like, it's just a bunch of stuff in here that draws cards and grinds, and it's definitely piqued my interest a couple of times now.
It almost looks like a modern deck is the thing. Like if it had Unearth, this would just be a modern deck instead of Call of the Death Dweller.
Yeah, exactly. Wow, what a difference between those two cards, right?
Yeah. So I think there's something interesting here. I might try to play it and talk about it on a future ep.
Yeah. And the last deck that I wanted to talk about really quickly that I thought was sweet, Shane mentioned it earlier, Blue-White Cycling Control, piloted by Awesome Maxi 1 in the Pioneer Challenge. It only went 3-3, but it's basically a take all the control cards that have cycling in a deck with Drake Haven and Abandoned Sarcophagus as payoffs, which Abandoned Sarcophagus lets you cast cards with cycling on them from your graveyard as normal. And then if a card has cycling that would be put in your graveyard from anywhere and it wasn't cycled, exile it instead. So you can do this kind of like cycle it to draw a card, get it in your graveyard, and then replay it for full value out of the graveyard whenever you want to, kind of thing, which is pretty sweet. I mean, it seems like it was moderately successful, but this has Shark Typhoon in it, Stan's new favorite card, and Teferi Time Raveler, Teferi Master of Time to help you with some discarding as well. So this is just kind of like a cool, weird iteration on blue-white control.
I also want to talk about these mono green devotion decks that we saw come in 9th and 24th in a challenge. And they're built surprisingly differently from one another, and also differently from the deck that I'm going to be talking about a little bit later in the dive down. I do know how to pronounce this name, so forgive me. It's like Thenana Guyan. They went 4-2 in the challenge. They ran only 4 Nissas as the Planeswalkers, but they also had 3 Great Henge, 4 Genesis Hydra, and 4 Llanowar Visionaries, as well as Elvish Visionary. So this is kind of like a cantrip creature, mana dork, even the big mana dork of Llanowar Visionary that combines the power of Elvish Mystic and Elvish Visionary. So that was novel and different. El Yellow went 3-3, and they focus on more of a traditional build, but they also ran Karn the Great Creator. Like some of the other recent Green Devotion decks have been excluding, because they're kind of going back to like, can we be classic mono green devotion more or less? And those decks are of course running for Oath of Nissa, and also Oath of Nissa is having an impact on 5-color Niv Mizzet. So the Niv to Light decks that showed up twice in our results as well, those are running a full 4 of Oath of Nissa. And I'll talk about this later, but I faced down Niv to Light twice in a recent league. And both were using Oath of Nissa, I thought, to really good results, because you're finding needed cards in your deck. If you really need to, it can fix your mana for the Planeswalkers when you might be stuck a little bit. It can be bounced with Teferi 3 for really good value. It's a really good card in the deck, and the deck is something that I think people kind of forgot about and have been overlooking. And I think that this is a really flexible and powerful deck that can go over the top of some of the decks that we're seeing in the meta, and Oath of Nissa is definitely adding some power and consistency back to that deck. I saw some good players playing the deck, so keep an eye on it.
I wish there was but one Ensoul deck here. Alas, there is not.
Not even one.
Not one. Looking at this metagame, and if we lived in a normal society where we were allowed to play at the local game store because there wasn't a pandemic, I wouldn't have anything to play in Pioneer unless I wanted to just like play in Soul out of, love and affection for that deck. Maybe it'll make a comeback. Maybe we'll get some more good artifacts. Okay, that said, winner's metagame. There's actually a couple, what I would say, surprises here. We have 22 decks in total that went 5-0, 4-1, or top 8. Of those 22, there's 11 different decks. And the most successful among them was Mono Black Aggro, which appeared 6 times in our winner's bracket.
Yeah, deck's good. It's really good.
That's big, though. That's like way better conversion rate than anything in Modern had.
Yeah, it's quite good. I mean, the deck it's built to prey on the metagame, mainly because it can run hand disruption, both main deck and sideboard. And I think people, they're not sleeping on it, but I think Thoughtseize is such a ridiculously powerful card to be able to run and not really take you off tempo, because it's just so cheap, and you can sort of fit it in wherever you think, like, okay, well, it's turn 3, opponent's going to untap, I can cast it now, I can also cast 2 other 1-drops while I'm doing so. You don't have to cast it turn 1, you can get your aggressive game plan going.
Yeah, and as you might expect, once again, Thoughtseize was the most played card in our sample. I don't think that's any surprise there, followed very closely by Fatal Push.
I think we can even say that Thoughtseize is just the best card in Pioneer.
Yeah, I think so. I thought so for a long time. Still true.
It's so good. I got Thoughtseized a lot by Niv Mizzet decks, by inverter decks recently in my play testing. Even Thought Erasure type effects. All those cards. There's just a lot of cards that are doing those type of effects, and they are hard to face down.
Thought Experiment. Maybe we should ban Thoughtseize.
You're not the first person to suggest this.
I'm not?
No.
Weird.
I said a couple weeks ago that I feel like it's an important piece of interaction, and it is also an important safety valve on the format. And I still feel that way, but
it's just such a double-edged sword where it's like it's important against the combo decks and Inverter, but Inverter is just playing it too.
Right. And they're all going to do that. Like, not all, but lots of decks that are able to are just going to run it as a piece of defense and a piece of offense as well. So I don't know, Stan, maybe that's right.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I'd like to revisit Mono Black and further episode discussion, of course, but what's coming after Mono Black here, Stan? What's like our tier 2 in our winners metagame, at least?
Right. So if Mono Black is tier 1 because it had the most copies, our tier 2, which had 3 copies, is Mono White Devotion and Dimir Inverter.
Yep.
The reason I was surprised is just because I kind of thought Dimir would still be the most successful deck.
I mean, when everyone's coming out to get you, you know what I mean? Like, this is kind of Mono Black is really back, and people are really playing Mono Black this past week, and people were tuned against Mono Black while also being tuned against Dimir Inverter. So perhaps just the sheer, the speed of Lotus Breach, the speed of Burn, Mono White Devotion is teched against Dimir Inverter, Mono Black Aggro is teched against Dimir Inverter. When you're up against that kind of hate in the field, I'm not too surprised to not see it overperform in terms of like the top 8 and really good record representation, at least.
Shane, I gotta ask though, how do you tech against Inverter though?
Well, so what Mono Black's doing a lot is they have not only main deck disruption and main deck speed, but they have a lot of the sideboard is heavily teched against it, right? Like they have a lot of the sort of surgical style effects where they're like, I'm going to name a card and get it out of your hand and deck type thing. They frequently are playing things like Brain Maggot and just effects like that can try to stymie the Dimir Inverter player. I mean, Mono White would not be playing things like Gideon's Intervention if there wasn't a Dimir Inverter world out there.
Right behind Inverter is Mono Red Aggro and Lotus Breach, both of which had 2 copies in our winner's bracket. I think we can put these 4 decks, with the exception of mono black aggro, as kind of like the tier 1.5 and above. Pleased to see mono red aggro still putting up work. You know, there was a point where like chonky red was just not that good anymore.
I'm curious if that is something that if Niv to Light becomes more powerful, we know that mono red just gets steamrolled by Niv to Light because it goes over the top.
Yeah.
And so I think it's the kind of stuff where it's like, oh man, if only we didn't have this crazy powerful top end of the format, maybe this would be like our dynamic metagame that we saw before. Like, you know, in the early stages of the format, we saw certain things creeping up and getting really powerful, and then things were going over the top of them, and it became kind of like, what's the biggest big mid-range? And now you could try to maybe go under that with like the hardest aggressive decks, or maybe with combo decks or things like that. And we just have to sort of infer from really small sample sizes, like what's going on here and like what could be, because we have the presence of Inverter and the decks that are teched against it up at the top.
Yeah, and I'm just realizing, you know, earlier I mentioned that Niv to Light that there was no Uro deck. Niv to Light is the Uro deck, right? And so it's the mid-range deck. It's grinding with Uro. It'll be interesting to see if these continue to gain in popularity and just kind of keep trying to tweak from where they are right now, because yeah, Oath does help a deck like this quite a bit.
The rest of the iceberg, we got Dave's Niv, we got Stompy, Esper Control, Burn, Boros Feather, and Azorius Spirits.
It's interesting that Stompy has not really made a comeback, because I remember reading takes from better players than myself about how Golgari does have the tools, or potentially seems like it has the tools, to go up against some of the big players in the meta, because it can still run Thoughtseize, it can run Fatal Push, it can run removal and really big creatures to do a really nice clock. And maybe just mono black is just more consistent at doing what it's doing. It can go wider. It can now has the flying enchantment. So there's probably a number of reasons why you would choose to do mono black aggro over Golgari Stompy, but it's just one of those things that fell off and never was picked back up.
All right, that is our very long hour-and-a-half breakdown. We're going to take a very, very quick break. It's as long or short as our usual breaks are, but we're going to put in the buffer music. And when we come back, we're just going to check in on some of the testing that we've been doing most recently. Maybe it's an unofficial Sleeve Believe Heave. Who knows? Maybe we'll talk about historic. Anything can happen. So stay with us. And we're back. So, Dave, you've been on vacation, but you could not wait to come back and shuffle some cards.
It's true.
Digitally.
And Shane, too, was on vacation and then came back and shuffled some cards.
Shane returned home early from vacation because of how much he wanted to shuffle those cards.
I wanted to see my cats. They're so fluffy.
That's fair.
But Stan, you've also been shuffling a lot of cards.
I think I did 7 days of shuffling. And
I kind of want to hear your journey first, because I think you've done some interesting stuff, and it includes one topic that we kind of glossed over in the modern breakdown.
Yeah. So thank you, Dave, for giving me this platform. I think the topic you're referring to that we glossed over is the Mana Traders qualifiers.
That and one specific deck that you played in the Mana Traders, one extremely hyped deck from Twitter over the weekend.
Yeah, it was hyped up on Friday. I jumped right on it as soon as we found out what it was. Because people were doing the thing that was like, they're posting their screenshots of their trophies, and they're like, I got the secret deck. Yeah. I'm going to spike the challenge. And then a couple hours later, they revealed what the secret was.
Yep. So you've been playing the Mana Traders event a lot, though.
Yeah. And look, for people who are not familiar, the way the Mana Traders event works is you have this free qualifying period where you have to meet a certain minimum match win percentage within a certain amount of games played. And then if you meet that minimum, you qualify for a Swiss. And then if you do well in the Swiss, you go on to, like, I think it's a top 8 or something. I don't know. I've never qualified before. And I'm currently sitting in 80th place. I have qualified 64% match win percentage across 28 matches played.
That's awesome.
So I started it playing Ponza just because I felt like that's what I had the strongest grasp on. And, I've kind of been saying, like, if I'm going to take a modern tournament seriously, I'm just going to play Ponza because it's good and I know how to play it. And I was doing pretty well. I was hovering in the high 50s, but I didn't meet the 10 match minimum. And again, to just pull the curtain back, like, the more games you play, the smaller that match win percentage has to be. And like, if you do it in 10 wins, you have to get like 65% or above.
Which is 7 and 3, I think, right? Is that what you have to do?
I think that's right. Everett did that. Yamakiller may have done it too, actually.
You got to do a 4-1 and a 3-2, basically.
Right. And then like from 10 to 20, it's, I think, 60. And then, I don't know. It doesn't matter. The point is, I was playing Ponza. I was doing pretty well, but I couldn't quite get that position. So then I decided I was just going to switch to Izzet Blitz, which is another deck I know how to play. And I figured I'm going to go fast and be aggressive.
And we did play each other a bit a couple of weeks ago, or a week and a half ago, socially distant, played, I piloted Izzet Blitz, and Stan was like, "You actually like this?" And I was like, "Yeah, I like it." And we'll talk about that more in a minute, but Stan gave it a shot too.
Right. Didn't go well for me in the Mana Traders. I was like doing okay with Ponza and hovering at 57. 3 losses in a row with Izzet Blitz. I'm looking at my record now. It was 1-2, 0-2, 0-2. And I dropped down to 50%. And I was like, never doing that again. So I was going to revert back to Ponza. And then on Friday, I had a little bit of free time. And like Twitter was abuzz with this new mono white tokens deck. And I rented it on Mana Traders. I did a couple practice matches in the tournament practice room just to get a feel for it. And I was like, I think there's something here. So then I went back into the tournament and I went 7-1 with it to secure my place after like beating Grixis mid-range control. I beat Ponza, Prowess. I lost to Etron once, and then I beat Etron again. So I was like playing real decks, basically, and I was just like crushing them with this mono white tokens deck.
Can you tell us a little bit about the deck? Because I haven't even heard you talk about any of the lines in particular or what's in it or any of that kind of stuff. Now, I know that when you say mono white tokens, it means mono white tokens. It's basically every card that generates 2 1/1s of any type of creature type or flying or not flying. I know it tops off its curve with a bunch of spectral processions. It's got Gideon, ally of Zendikar in it. So I'd love to hear you talk about a little bit about just like what it was like to play this Buzz deck, because people were posting insane results on Twitter with it.
Yeah, and it was funny just because like people were posting insane results, and then there was a lot of level-headed people, I think including Everett, that were like, there's no way this is good. Andrew Aaron Bogan tweeted like, there's no way this is good. But results-oriented thinking, obviously, if I'm winning with it, it's got to be okay. So what the deck is doing, like Dave said, is just playing a bunch of token makers. And that actually includes 4 copies of Legion's Landing, but then you've got like 4 Gather the Townsfolk, 4 Raise the Alarm, Servo Exhibition. Spectral Procession is kind of like your finisher, and that's the one that makes 3 Flying Spirits. But it's also pumping up all these tokens by using Intangible Virtue. 1 and a white creature tokens you control get +1 and have Vigilance. Vigilance is very important. Mm-hmm. And here's my favorite card in the deck. 4 Force of Virtue, which is the white force, and you can pitch it with flash, enchantment, creatures get +1/+1.
Shane, remember how you told me that would never be in a deck?
Well, yeah. I mean, we saw we've mentioned Everett a number of times this episode. Very early on in the Modern Horizons meta, he was doing like some Force of Virtue shenanigans with a Squadron Hawk and whatnot. So.
Yeah. Surprisingly, this deck is not running the Squadron Hawk trick, which I was really shocked to see because it seems so good with Force of Virtue. But really, this deck just wants to cast cards that make more than one body at a time, and that's it.
Yeah. Okay. So, and like, obviously I've been thinking about this deck a lot since I played with it and trying to understand like why people don't like it and the power that I sort of felt with it. And here's kind of what my experience boils down to. With the backup of all of these enchantments that pump your creatures, it makes your 2 mana make 2 token spells trade up for cards. So Raise the Alarm ends up being this amazing top deck because it's not making 1/1s, it's making 2 2s or 3 3s. and your opponents have to point like their bolts and fatal pushes and removal at them. And when they do that, they're down a card, but you still have a body on the board. So I just found that, like, in effect, your token makers were very often 2-for-1s or better.
But this is like not a new concept. We've had black-white tokens as like an old, always not very great deck in Modern since the bygone days. Like, what's better about this deck that's allowing tokens to suddenly be something that you're considering powerful?
I don't know what the black-white tokens deck does except like play Sorin. Like I don't know if it has as many static enchantment-based pump effects.
I mean, the whole idea is intangible virtue and, procession and, raise the alarm and things like that. Actually, I don't think it ran raise the alarm. It ran like lingering souls and whatnot.
Yeah.
So
I think that this deck, from my estimation of looking at it versus the old black, I mean, keep in mind, the only Modern event deck that was ever sold was a black-white tokens shell. You know what I mean? It was the pre-con that they sold. I think the difference is this deck is set up to be faster, and now, after a couple more years, there's more token generators that are just, here's 2 or 3 creatures on a white card, cast it, so you don't need black anymore. This deck, has Force of Virtue, which is a different thing, so you get to be able to play an Anthem for free, essentially, even though it's a 2-for-1.
Right.
But you make up that card disadvantage by having tokens that are having cards that make more than 1 token. And so it seems possible, and Stan picked it up and went 7-1 with it, that's a heck of a run, man. That's a GP day 2 right there, 7-1.
So here's the thing. The deck is also running Loxodon.
Which is this guy.
Yeah, Venerated Loxodon is pretty cool because it's another way to pump your board, sometimes for very cheap, because he has Convoke, and every creature used to Convoke him gets a +1/+1 counter. And I found that to be super important as well. I will say, I didn't feel like the deck was quote-unquote fast. Like, this deck is not threatening turn 3, turn 4 kills basically ever, because your creatures are too small. It felt more like a more mid-rangey strategy that just is taking its time to like create a board full of ground bodies that just are really hard to fight through and are backed up by Path to Exile in case your opponents have big creatures of their own. And then eventually I found that more often than not, I'm just winning off of my spectral processions. Just because like 3 flyers, which are sometimes 2/2s or 3/3s, just becomes untenable for people to deal with.
Yeah.
Gideon is also, fine, though I would periodically side him out.
Yeah. Well, interesting. I mean, I'm glad that it pulled you over the finish line. Are you excited to play in the Swiss on Saturday of this week, or is it Saturday of next week? I think it's Saturday. Right?
I really should check. I have no idea. I just wanted to qualify. I didn't really think about the next step. Of course I'm excited. If I win, maybe I can make some money. Here's my final point about this deck, though. Tournament aside, I feel like the fun thing here, whether or not this becomes the new tier 1, probably not. I think we're just going to have a new staple in our 5-0 dumps. And, in the good old days, we would talk about like the decks you can play to bring to FNM, maybe even spike in FNM. And I think this deck plays on an axis that a lot of like mid-range or other aggro strategies can't really interact with profitably. Like K-Command doesn't feel very good against this when you can like instant speed pump your board and like get a card, get yourself to 0 cards using Force of Virtue.
Yeah.
So the fact that it can like do something strong against people that aren't packing wraths for all of your tokens or counter spells for your enchantments, like feels like a way to maybe spike an event when people are not prepared. If we were having IQs, I could see this deck like pulling out top 8s and SCG IQs, for example.
Yeah. Are you going to play it in the Swiss, or are you going to go back to Ponza?
I'm thinking about it, man. Like, if we're going to have professional Magic players tweeting about how bad this deck is, and I'm going to have a room full of people that don't respect it and are unprepared, I feel like this could just give me a deck advantage, because although there's like important lines to be cognizant of, and knowing how to sideboard is really important, and recognizing like what you're vulnerable to is obviously key to like winning high level events. I think if people are not coming prepared, or I can dodge like a bunch of control matchups, it might be okay. It's between those 2 decks though. Let's be real.
There you go.
I guess the other journey I went on in the last week is I hit Mythic and Arena,
Historic is, I guess it's just you were playing historic.
I
They're
was
not
just
different
playing
categories,
historic
but
best of
yeah.
one. That's right. Whether or not you play standard or historic, it all goes to your same thing. And we've been talking about historic on the pod. Dave made the brilliant point is that like maybe we should start playing arena just to kind of future proof us from the day that MTGO goes down. So I was like, why not? I have like an old collection from Guilds of Ravnica Standard. So I just played mono red all the way to the top. It took me about 6 days. I hit Mythic. I'll get some cards and packs and gold, I guess. I don't know.
I'm still so mad you didn't use a tracker because your win rate had to have been like 70% at least. Like with how few games I think you actually had to play in that time period. It's crazy.
Stan is very impressive. That's all I have to say.
It's surreal to me. I don't feel like I'm the strongest player on the pod, but I had a hot week.
Running hot is how you win. So good work, Stan.
You got to be lucky and good. Shane, what did you get up to?
Well, I was trying to see if Oath of Nissa was doing anything for Mono Green Devotion and Pioneer. And also I wanted to see what leagues were looking like again. Because there's that sort of sentiment, well, maybe the leagues are a lot of different decks. Like maybe the leagues are where we're going to see those weird decks. And my testing in like the tournament practice room was a little bit random. Of course, you never know what you're going to get there. But man, my league, you'll see what my league was like. Okay, so I rented this Jerry T list that he posted in a recent SCG article. It was kind of generally the mono green list you might expect. It wasn't super tuned, but Jerry's always starting from a pretty good place. So I just was like, okay, let's just use a Jerry list. There's a lot of ramp. Like 8 elves, 3 carry added, and like your payoffs are kind of like the walkers and Voracious Hydra and Walking Ballista, and Courser of Crufix is sort of bridging the gap between early and late game and gives you devotion and whatnot, right? And I think also if I had played against Mono Black, then Courser would have felt a lot better than it ended up feeling, but we'll get to that. And so I went into a league, and I promptly waited 7 full minutes for my first round. This was like 3 p.m. Mountain time. And after which waiting, I was then paired with the trophy leader of Pioneer, Claudio. And Claudio is on 5-color Niv. And then my next opponent, Osodon, had 4 trophies, also on 5-color Niv. And these decks just rolled me. Like I wasn't even like I had a turn 2 with 3 Burning Tree emissaries and still wasn't able to get the job done, because if Niv makes like turn 5 or even turn 4 sometimes, you're likely dead, because they have all the colors of the rainbow. They are casting a Bring to Light to get their sweeper. They're casting a Niv to get major card advantage, and then probably get another Bring to Light to get a sweeper. Like they're just so flexible. And I did, like I mentioned earlier, I think Oath did add some stuff to these decks. I think it does a lot for them for 1 mana. And I did see like the Teferi shenanigans where they're bouncing the Oath and getting good value off that. So following these double Niv losses, I then ran into Inverter 3 straight games, or 3 straight matches, right? Including the second pace trophy leader, Harry 13.
So you played against 3 of the top 4 trophy board people?
Well, it's Osodon had 4 trophies, which probably puts them in like the top 15 or something like that. Okay. So like, I played against people who are still in these leagues, right? There's like 250 people left in these leagues.
Oh man.
And I played against some of the better players, and they all rolled me, right? So my wins somehow were against 2 of these Inverter decks, and I think they just didn't have it. Like they just didn't get there. And I actually talked a lot to Harry 13. Really nice person. I know, don't open the chat, but I was in the mood for some chit chat, and I had good conversations with Claudio and with Harry 13, talking about Inverter, talking about Niv, and it was fine. I didn't love playing against 2 decks total. Like I remember in the 5th match, I was talking to you guys, and I was like, I think maybe this isn't Inverter. And then I was like, maybe this is mono blue devotion. And then, oh no, there's a swamp. It's
Womp.
But in terms of like how green was feeling, it didn't seem particularly crazy any longer. There's been so many pieces taken out of that deck where you just don't have the ley line explosiveness any longer. Like, I cast a 14-15 Voracious Hydra, and then just gets fatal pushed. You know what I mean? Like all of my stuff, all my payoffs would just disappear with hand disruption because I just faced so much hand disruption from both the Niv decks and the inverter decks. And I would have faced that in the mono black decks too if I'd faced off against those popular decks. So I'm sort of just feeling like I get a lot of mana and I have a lot of pips, but I have like 2 mana dorks and a Burning Tree Emissary, and I'm hoping to top deck something amazing that wouldn't immediately get removed or have like immediate value on the game, right?
So I don't have your list in front of me at the moment. Do you run that new Garruk's Harbinger?
No. None of the devotion decks seem to be running Garruk's Harbinger.
I wonder if you can try it.
I mean, you could try it, sure.
Protection from black seems really important right now. If we're trying to
get in Vinemare, you go back to that.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, why not?
Why not?
I just like that Harbinger. Like, it has hexproof from black, not pro black, but it also can like get you cards. So against something like mono black or against even inverter, because inverter can revolt a fatal push, but it doesn't matter when you've got functional pro black that it's just going to like always swing in, and there's nothing they can do about it.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that take, but I think the issue is not necessarily just surviving the removal. It's applying a significant enough clock fast enough that's really going to get the job done versus Wraths or versus the inverter combo. And what you're saying, Stan, makes me think about the Theana Guyan deck that has Genesis Hydra, right? And I think that concept seems pretty solid right now because it's a big value and it's a cast trigger. So you're getting value off of the Hydra kind of no matter what you're doing, right? And it also gives you just potential 2-for-1. Doesn't even have to resolve and doesn't even have to survive to get some kind of value. I'm not really sold yet on like the piles of mana dorks and the cantrippy creatures in this person's deck, but the Great Henge is there to make them a lot bigger, right? So every time you cast one of those 2/2s for 2 or something like that, or even your mana dorks, they're not as insignificant as they once were. And so I think that's a good way to say, I want to get some value out of my long game here. Like I want to get value out of my mana dork, even if it's a 1 mana 2/2, it's still something, right? And so that's a concept there that I think is good. I think Genesis Hydra might be something to test out more if you're going to keep playing these style of decks. But going back to kind of the original concept of this is like Oath of Nissa in Mono Green Devotion just felt like a big who cares, like way too often, right? Like I'm sure it's runnable, but definitely didn't feel like it was adding significant level of powers back into this deck by any means. And it's just like it's sort of free. It's something that lets you get to the pieces that you want, and this deck does have a lot of potential air in the mid to late game. So I think it's probably better actually to sort of sandbag this more often than I probably was. Because then you can just say, well, I have my mana is set up now, so now I can get to that walker that I want without putting it into my hand, without exposing it to Thoughtseize. So maybe saving it and then saying, well, I can get to what I want and then play it in the same turn is probably like a smarter move if you don't need the devotion right away. But I mean, I still really like the style of deck that this plays. I really missed Karn. I think I would really want to go back to a Karn build, versus something like that has 4 Courser of Crewfix, for instance. But then as soon as I do that, I'll probably face like mono black or red. I'll be like, I really wish I had that Courser.
Did you feel like there was room to iterate, or just because like I kind of hear the feeling that I get every time I try to run out Elves in Modern when a new set comes out? Was it that hopeless, or do you think there's actually potentially room to metagame against what's going on?
The one problem with this deck, the main problem, is that it's really not well insulated against Thoughtseize decks. And it's not particularly well insulated against removal decks. So it's not a great place to be, right? Where you're like, well, I really want my mana dorks to survive, which is why you're playing more like things like Caryatids nowadays, because you're like, well, this is hexproof and it's doing good work for you there. And so you're kind of up against a wall just already by picking the deck. Because you're saying, like, I need to get to turn 4, turn 3 at the best, have the threat that I kept in my opener stay in my hand that whole time, and then be able to survive through a hero's downfall or through an eliminate or something like that. I mean, this deck is not as exposed to eliminate, of course, because the walkers cost more. But there's just so many pieces that the other decks that are popular right now can prey upon that it's just like, it has tools, and I think you lose a lot of those tools if you don't run Karn. So I mean, it's just a little bit of experimentation. It's just a league and some testing in the test rooms. But right now, it's not the kind of world where you're like, yeah, you can do whatever you want in the leagues, because you're gonna face Inverter because people want to win.
Did you try that new M21 card, Scavenging Ooze?
Scavenging Ooze. It's in the sideboard. I did win a game versus Inverter by getting Ulamog with my Vivian Arcbow Ranger, which is always fun. But I think it's a good amount of summary of that deck, because I do want to hear what you've been doing, Dave, because you've been doing a lot of one deck, which I love. That's good testing. This is good data.
I think
going infinite with it.
I think everyone knows what I've been up to. Yeah, I've been going infinite, as Stan just said. You know me. I like to play the most popular deck. I have just been grinding whenever I can with blue-red Prowess. I don't even know why. Like, when I started, after I reviewed it on the show, or was doing some kind of iterations on a shell like this on the show, and hit on the Spider Space shell that I liked a lot at the end of that whole journey, I just felt like I wasn't done with it, and so ever since then, whenever I've picked up a league for Modern or whatever, because we didn't have a deck dive to do, I would just register it and take it through a league. And so I kept messing around with stuff, but mostly just playing the Spider Space build that has Surgical Extraction and Crash Through, and really is just mono red Prowess plus Storming Entity and Surgical Extraction, and 2 mutagenic growths in the main deck, like upping the Phyrexian mana spells, and just kind of going for it. And I've been playing it a lot. It's been feeling really good. It felt really good against a lot of the different decks in the format, regardless of whether, it loses a lot to Uro decks, but it kind of does well against everything else, especially with all the surgicals. I've also been keeping an eye on the other decks that have been emerging, as some of the really big kind of moto grinders have been picking up, including most notably Baututina, who is one of the trophy board leaders, and I've seen 4-1 with this. I think I've seen them 5-0 with it, but their version includes Opt over Crash Through, has a couple of Sprite Dragons in the main, so it has more blue spells. So I've been keeping an eye on it, and it seems like, it was just working, and I was enjoying playing it, and it was kind of like fitting for where my mind space was for just playing Magic right now, which is like, I know how to pilot Prowess pretty well, and this has some extra dimensions to Prowess that I thought were really cool, and so I was just investigating to see if Storming Entity was a good card or not. And like Stan said, I have kind of been going infinite by the strictest definition of it, which is I've played 6 leagues with this deck in the last 7 days or so. I took like 5 days off in the middle of the week, but I did 3 last weekend. I did 3 this weekend, and I have 6 3-2s in a row with different builds of this deck. So I'm just taking the play points, putting them back in, firing it back off again, and just kind of keep going. And I got to say, I've talked about it in the chat a lot, so I'm sure that people who are in the Slack server with me are sick of hearing me say this stuff, but like, Stormwing Entity's a real card, I feel like now, finally. Like, it's real. There's a bunch of reasons for it. I talked about some of these on the testing episode, but I think it's worth bringing up again, because I think you're going to play against this deck if you're in the modern queues right now, and even if you're in some of the tournaments, I think it's going to happen.
So I have this deck built in paper.
Yes, I played your copy, since I do not have it in paper.
Yeah, I was likewise very impressed with Stormwing, and I feel like it doesn't slow the deck down for a 5-drop.
Yeah.
Like that. That's all that Mono Red Prowess is doing differently. It's just like it's playing blue mana to cast this 5-drop on turn 2, and it's so good at just setting up kills on turn 3 or turn 4. Or sometimes you can just chain a couple Stormwings together, and then it's like, deal with my 3/3 flying prowess creatures.
Yeah, and so I have a couple of different takes on like why I think this card is really, has changed what this deck can do. Because I do feel like mono red prowess at a certain point in time was like either you kill them on turn 3 or you grind up to a Bedlam Reveler on turn 5 or you die. And there's not a whole lot of margin for error. And I feel like what happened with Stormwing is that it's actually opened the margin of error in this deck a little bit, where you're not quite as reliant on perfect draws or really specific draws anymore. You can kind of play a game that's a little more adaptable, and you can change even more to the game plan that your opponent is presenting to you with this deck for a couple of reasons, just because of Stormwing. I think. What do you think about that thought, Stan?
I think that's interesting, though I would need to be told why, since like all of your cards do the same thing. Like
I've got some reasons why. You ready to hear them?
Yeah, sure. And just so like we set the stage, most of your cards are just pinging for 1.
Right.
Sometimes they're doing it for no mana, or they're like 1 mana prowess creatures, or they're Stormwing entity.
Right.
Or I guess there's Manamorphose and Crash Through, but that's it. Like,
and Bedlam Reveler.
Sure. But it feels like the deck isn't very sophisticated, so it's interesting to hear you say that it's versatile.
Well, here's what I think. I think that, if and I mentioned this a couple weeks ago, when we had Ryan Overturf on to talk about mono red prowess, he was like, the place that this deck has always struggled is that it doesn't have a good 2-drop in mono red, right? There's never been a card like Kiln Fiend some people liked, and the Phoenix plan was awesome for a while, of course, for this deck, and that was maybe a totally different deck if you think of it that way. I think that essentially what this is that Stormwing filled a hole of being the best 2-drop that this deck could have available to it, right? That's what the main purpose of the card is. Now, for it to be a good card as a 2-drop, that does not mean that you have to cast it on turn 2. I would just like to point that out. And there's a couple other specific reasons that I think Stormwing is very good and change the deck. So I'm just going to go through this list of bullets that I have here. One is, the number one thing to me about this is that Lightning Bolt, it's the number one card in Modern that we saw in our sample size. And Stormwing is an extra threat that is resilient to Lightning Bolt with a little bit of work out of this deck that it didn't have before. Okay? To do that, you have to keep a spell up or keep a free spell up or just keep your heads up when you're about to cast Stormwing out there. But because it has 3 toughness already, it's a little bit resilient to Lightning Bolt, which I think is super helpful. At the same time, you can't kill it with Fatal Push. You can't kill it with Abrupt Decay. Those are gigantic things, especially with a deck like Sultai Control floating around, where they have to basically have Dismember to be able to take care of this card. So, huge kind of like blind spot for a bunch of decks right now is that they just can't kill Stormwing Entity. Path is not very popular at the moment, realistically. The second thing is that flying is super important to this deck as an extra dimension, because before you had to have a crash through in order to get your Soulscar Mage and your Monastery Swift Spirit through a complicated board, right? You need to have crash through, you need to trample over people, do a bunch of spells, hope that it's enough to get over the top. Now you can just fly over the top. And this is a creature that has high power on its own when it comes into play. Not high, it's a 3, but it's a lot higher than trying to attack with a bunch of 1/2s when you don't have any spells to trigger off prowess. So it can be either a decent flying attack or a very good flying attack with some extra spells thrown on top. Scry is just really good and helps the card have value even if it dies immediately. It adds a little bit of extra ability to groom the cards that you're going to be drawing, which Bedlam Reveler sort of, Scry 2 is some functional card advantage. Light at the Stage is some card advantage. Bedlam Reveler is some card advantage. This is just another piece that gives you some like ability to have better draws, which the deck lacked a little bit. The final thing is that adding blue to the deck to have a little bit of blue interaction out of the sideboard, I think is very valuable. In particular, you get to run Aether Gust, which is huge. And you can also run, I've been running Mystical Dispute. I think that there's a chance that you can probably play Ceremonious rejection out of the side if you want to, if you're really worried about E-Tron, but it opens up having a little bit more interaction if you need to, where on the other hand, you can be super duper aggro if you want to as well. So look, I've even, after having flying this deck, I've opened my heart to Sprite Dragon a little bit again. And
what'd you find in there?
I mean, it's been okay as a 2-of in the build that I played with Opt in it as well. I am worried about the mana in these versions that have more blue spells in them. I think that they're a lot more vulnerable to things like Field of Ruin, and because you can't search up a blue source if you're in a bad way. So that's concerning. It's more vulnerable to Blood Moon, of course, but it's good to have a couple of extra options. I like Crash Through better than Opt, I think, ultimately when it comes down to it, but I might be able to be swayed the other way. But I think the thing is playing around to keep your threats alive with the Phyrexian mana and Stormwing Entity and things like that added a lot of ability to kind of go into the mid game with this deck and possibly survive, where you don't have to just like win by turn 4 in order to win. You can easily play a medium game, win on turn 6 or turn 7 and be fine and have it feel like it still all went to plan. So, I after playing with this for a while, I'm definitely upgrading my grade on this deck from just like a believe to being like a sleeve. I think it's a legit version of Prowess at this point. I don't know if it's going to be the best one forever, but with Lightning Bolt being predominant in the meta, I think it's a pretty good version of the deck to be out there. I think that if Path to Exile gets better, you're going to like this deck a lot less, but it is what it is.
Do you think it might be just the best Bolt deck right now, or is that Ponza? Because I'll say in our very small sample size testing Prowess against Ponza, it felt like Prowess was favored.
Yeah, I don't think it is. For what it's worth, I just think I got lucky playing against you. I had multiple games where I drew multiple Aether Gusts, which is not always easy to do. But I think that they run Bolt for very different reasons. And so I think Prowess probably gets the most out of Bolt, where Ponza has to run it because it needs to run some kind of removal. And that's the best removal spell ever, and it can run it, so it does. But Ponza isn't as much looking to bolt people to death, which I'm definitely looking to do in Prowess. I mean, I think it's a real deck. I think it's a good deck. I was shocked to see how many the count was, both in our little record and also in Goldfish's, because I thought that maybe I was just kind of toiling away in sort of like obscurity, because I was like, this card seems cool and it seems to be working and I'm not losing any tickets playing it, so I'm just going to keep playing it.
I mean, well, you are toiling away in obscurity. But...
Yeah. Still. But I'm definitely going to try, I'm still off work, as we kind of joked about a little bit earlier at the beginning of the podcast. And, with some of my free time, I'm going to try to qualify for day 2 of Mana Traders 2. And this is the deck I've been grinding. I'm going to see what happens. Right now, I'm 1-1 in the Mana Traders. I haven't had a chance to go back and try some more, but
you have to do it tomorrow. The qualifying period ends on the 21st. So today may have been your last day, or tomorrow's your last day.
Oh no, I thought that I had a couple more days. Okay.
Maybe it's the 23rd, but you're running out of time, David. Hurry. Tomorrow, just play Magic all day.
I mean, I can. I was planning on it.
Good, and you should. Okay. Well, that was fun. Thanks, guys, for playing decks. Doing well with some, doing worse with others, all in the name of science and fun radio. That does wrap up this week's show. If you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe to our podcast so you get the latest episodes as soon as they come out. And if you use Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and review. If you'd like to submit a question to the podcast or pick our brain on something in Modern or Pioneer, you can tweet us at thedivedown, all one word, or email thedivedown@gmail.com. If you'd like to support the show, you can join our Patreon over at patreon.com/thedivedown. Also, shout out to manatraders.com for sponsoring the Dive Down. You can support us while playing Magic by signing up for Mana Traders using promo code TheDiveDown, all one word, and get 15% off your first 3 months of renting Magic Online cards. And if you spike the Mana Traders tournament series, you'll get more prize money if you are a Mana Trader subscriber. As always, special thanks to the bands Nowhere and Spaceblood for letting us use their music. And until next week, get out there and level the meta!